The night I first saw him standing in my candlelit parlor, I knew my carefully guarded world would never be the same again. 21 years of motherhood, of scraped knees and whispered lullabies, of proud smiles and gentle scoldings, had not prepared me for the way my heart would stop at the sight of a man who should not exist. It was the 23rd of November, 1887, and London's fog pressed against my windows like the breath of restless spirits. The gaslight from Whitmore Lane flickered weakly through the thick yellow haze, casting shifting patterns across the modest parlor I had made home for myself and my children. Thomas had departed for his evening post at the Central Telegraph Office not an hour past, his tall frame finally filling out the charcoal wool coat I had sewn for him 3 winters ago when he still possessed the gangly limbs of boyhood. At 21, he had grown into a thoughtful young man whose dark eyes held depths I sometimes found unsettling, as though he carried knowledge that had no place in our humble existence. Eleanor sat by the hearth in her favorite chair, the one upholstered in faded rose damask that I had salvaged from a grand house in Belgrave Square during my early days as a seamstress. Her needle moved with practiced grace through the midnight blue wool of her best dress, preparing it for tomorrow's interview at Madame Rousseau's millinery establishment on Bond Street. The position would mark her entry into respectable society, a step forward I had dreamed of since I first held her as an infant and saw the refinement that seemed bred into her very bones. How proud I was of them both, my children who were not my children by blood, but were mine in every way that mattered. I had found them on that terrible storm-lashed night 21 years past, 2 tiny souls abandoned to the mercy of the elements outside the parish church of St. Margaret's. The storm had been unlike any I had witnessed before or since, with lightning that seemed to tear the very fabric of the sky and thunder that shook the foundations of London itself. When I discovered them, they were wrapped together in a blanket of the finest cashmere, soft as a whisper and marked only with an embroidered coat of arms I did not recognize. They had been perhaps 6 months old then. Thomas dark-haired and serious even in sleep, Eleanor fair as spun gold, with eyes like spring leaves. No note accompanied them, no explanation for their abandonment, yet from the moment I lifted them into my arms, I knew they were meant to be mine. The parish priest had made inquiries, of course, but no family came forward to claim them, and gradually the questions ceased. I named them for the saints of the church where I found them, Thomas and Eleanor, and I loved them as fiercely as any mother could love. The needle paused in my fingers as I worked on Mrs. Henderson's wedding gown, the ivory silk catching the lamplight like captured moonbeams. The intricate beadwork around the bodice had taken me weeks to complete, each tiny pearl sewn by hand in patterns that spoke of elegance and hope. It was to be finished by week's end, and the payment would see us comfortably through the winter months. My fingers had grown skilled over the years at creating beauty for others, though I had long since ceased to dream of wearing such finery myself. Something shifted in the air of our modest home then, a change so subtle yet so profound that even Eleanor looked up from her sewing, her green eyes wide with an unspoken question. The familiar sounds of our evening routine seemed muffled suddenly, as though the world had been wrapped in cotton wool. The gentle hiss of the gas lamp grew distant, the crackling of the coal fire faded to a whisper, and the steady tick of the mantel clock became as faint as a heartbeat heard through water. The temperature in the room began to drop with unnatural swiftness. I watched with growing unease as my breath began to mist before me, despite the fire that burned bright in the grate. Eleanor shivered and pulled her woolen shawl closer about her shoulders, her needle hovering uncertainly above her work. There was a quality to the cold that felt different from the November chill seeping through our windows, something that seemed to emanate from within the very walls of our home. "Mother," Eleanor whispered, her voice carrying a tremor I had not heard since she was a child, afraid of the dark. "Is there someone at the door?" I listened, straining to catch the sound of footsteps on our front steps or the rap of knuckles against wood, but heard nothing save the distant rumble of carriages on the cobblestones and the mournful cry of the foghorns from the Thames. Yet the sensation of a presence grew stronger, as though invisible eyes watched our every movement with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness. That was when I saw him. He stood in the corner where shadows pooled deepest, between the bookshelf that held my collection of novels and the small writing desk where I kept my accounts. The figure materialized slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, gaining substance and clarity until I could make out every detail of his aristocratic features. He appeared to be a man of perhaps 40 years, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples and eyes the color of a winter storm. His clothing spoke of wealth and position beyond anything I had ever encountered. A perfectly tailored black evening coat that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, a white shirt that gleamed with an inner radiance, and a black silk cravat secured with a pin that caught the firelight like captured stars. Yet there was something wrong, something impossible about his presence that made my rational mind rebel, even as my heart recognized him with a certainty that defied explanation. The candlelight seemed to pass through him rather than illuminate him, and when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of smoke or memory. He cast no reflection in the mirror that hung above the mantelpiece, though he stood directly before it, and when he breathed, no mist formed in the frigid air that surrounded him. Eleanor had not seen him. She continued her careful stitching, though her movements had grown hesitant and uncertain, as though she sensed something amiss without being able to identify its source. Her humming had ceased, and she glanced frequently toward the corner where he stood, but her gaze passed through him as though he were nothing more substantial than shadow and moonlight. I could not look away from the apparition that watched us both with such profound longing that my heart ached in response. His gaze lingered on Eleanor's face, studying every feature with the desperate intensity of a man dying of thirst who had found water at last. There was something reverent in his attention, something that spoke of love so deep and abiding that it had survived even death itself. When he looked at her, his aristocratic features softened with an emotion so pure and overwhelming that I felt tears prick my eyes. Then those stormy eyes turned to me, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. I should have been terrified. Any sensible woman would have screamed, would have gathered her daughter and fled into the foggy streets without a backward glance. Instead, I found myself rising slowly from my chair, the wedding gown sliding forgotten to the floor in a pool of ivory silk and scattered pearls. Some force I could not name drew me toward this impossible visitor, this man who looked at me as though I held the answers to every question that had ever tormented him. He was beautiful, in the way that sorrow is beautiful, in the way that autumn leaves are beautiful as they fall from dying trees. There was pain etched into every line of his aristocratic face, a grief so deep and enduring that it seemed to have become part of his very essence. His mouth, which I imagined had once smiled easily, was drawn with lines of suffering, and his eyes held shadows that spoke of loss beyond measure. Yet beneath the anguish, I glimpsed something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat with its intensity. Recognition, not of my face perhaps, but of something deeper, something that called to the very core of who I was. He looked at me as though he had been searching for me across impossible distances of time and space, as though my presence here, in this modest parlor with its faded furniture and flickering gaslight, was the answer to prayers he had offered to an unforgiving universe. I took another step toward him, my hand rising instinctively to reach out, to offer whatever comfort I could to this lost soul who emanated such profound need. The floorboards beneath my feet should have creaked, as they always did, but my movement produced no sound save the soft whisper of my woolen skirts. The air around him felt different, charged with an energy that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. When I finally dared to reach out, to bridge the impossible distance between the living and the dead, my fingers passed through empty air as cold as winter morning. He felt my touch, I was certain of it, for his eyes closed as though in ecstasy, and his form wavered like heat rising from summer pavement. For one breathless moment, I thought I felt the echo of warmth, the ghost of solid flesh beneath my palm. But then he faded like morning mist caught by the sun, leaving only the lingering scent of sandalwood and bergamot, and the echo of unspoken words that seemed to hang in the air like half-remembered music. Eleanor looked up then, her needle suspended mid-stitch, her green eyes wide with concern that spoke to the deep bond we had shared for 21 years. "Mother," she said, and her voice carried the same musical quality it had possessed since she first learned to speak, "you look as though you have seen a ghost." "Are you quite well? You have gone pale as moonlight." How could I tell her that I had indeed seen a ghost, that the impossible had invaded our peaceful evening and left me shaken to my very foundation? How could I explain that for one transcendent moment I had looked into the eyes of a man who was not alive and felt my soul recognize something it had been searching for without knowing? The practical part of me, the part that had learned to survive on wit and determination alone, whispered that I had been working too hard, that the strain of supporting our small household through the long hours of intricate needlework was finally taking its toll on my mind. But my heart knew better. My heart understood with a certainty that defied all logic that whatever force had brought Thomas and Eleanor into my life 21 years ago had not finished with us yet. The man I had seen, ghost or spirit or fragment of fevered imagination, was connected to them in some way that I could not yet fathom. The way he had looked at Eleanor, with such desperate love and longing, spoke of bonds that transcended the mortal world. "I am perfectly well, my dear," I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. Perhaps I have been straining my eyes too much in this poor light. The wedding gown requires such delicate work. I bent to retrieve the fallen garment, my hands trembling slightly as I smoothed the delicate fabric and checked for any damage to the intricate beadwork. The silk felt cold beneath my fingers, as cold as the air had grown when he appeared, and I could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something had awakened in the shadows of our peaceful existence, something that would demand answers I was not certain I was brave enough to seek. Eleanor rose from her chair and came to help me, her movements graceful despite the concern that clouded her features. She had always been sensitive to the moods and emotions of others, a quality that sometimes worried me in its intensity. As a child, she had often spoken of dreams that seemed more like memories, of places she had never been and people she had never met. I had attributed such fancies to an active imagination, but now I wondered if there was more to her visions than childish fantasy. Together, we examined the wedding gown for any harm, and I was relieved to find that none of the pearls had come loose and the delicate silk showed no signs of damage. As we worked, Eleanor's presence beside me was a comfort. Her quiet competence a reminder of all the small miracles that had filled our years together. She had grown into a young woman of remarkable beauty and grace, her fair hair catching the firelight like spun gold, her green eyes bright with intelligence and compassion. Yet as I watched her careful fingers check each bead and seam, I found myself studying her features with new eyes, searching for resemblances I had never dared to seek before. The aristocratic line of her nose, the delicate arch of her brows, the way she held her head with unconscious pride, all spoke of breeding far above our humble circumstances. Thomas possessed the same unmistakable air of refinement, the same unconscious assumption of quality that marked those born to privilege. I had always known they came from a world different from mine, but I had chosen not to delve too deeply into the mystery of their origins. They were mine to love and protect, and that had been enough. Now, however, the appearance of the ghostly figure had awakened questions I could no longer ignore. Who was he? What connection did he have to the children I had raised as my own? And why, after 21 years of silence, had he chosen this moment to reveal himself? Outside, the fog swirled thicker, pressing against our windows like grasping fingers and muffling the sounds of the city beyond. The gaslight in our street flickered uncertainly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose and intent. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the midnight hour, its deep bronze voice cutting through the silence like a call to prayer or a warning of danger to come. Eleanor yawned delicately and folded her mending, her preparations for tomorrow's interview complete. The midnight blue wool was now perfectly pressed and repaired, ready to help her make the best possible impression at the millinery shop. She kissed my cheek with the affection that had never diminished despite her growing independence, and bid me good night with the sweet formality that had always characterized her speech. "Sleep well, mother," she murmured, her voice soft with genuine love. "Do not work too late on Mrs. Henderson's gown. Your health is more important than any commission, no matter how generous." I promised her I would retire soon, though we both knew it was likely a gentle lie. My work often kept me up long past the hours when sensible people sought their beds, but it was a necessary sacrifice for our continued comfort and security. When Eleanor's footsteps had faded up the narrow staircase to the room she shared with Thomas, I remained seated by the dying fire, my eyes fixed on the corner where the apparition had stood. The silence that settled over our home was different from the peaceful quiet of other nights. There was a quality of waiting in it, an expectancy that made every shadow seem alive with possibility. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily, marking the passage of moments that felt suspended between the ordinary world I knew and something far stranger and more wonderful. I did not know his name then, did not understand the connection that bound him to my children or the terrible circumstances that had brought two infant souls into my care on that long-ago night of storm and sorrow. I knew only that he would return, as surely as the Thames flowed through the heart of London, and that when he did, my life would be forever changed. The certainty of it settled into my bones like winter cold, both terrifying and oddly comforting. The fire collapsed into glowing embers, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the papered walls. I found myself whispering a prayer to whatever powers governed love and loss, hope and heartbreak, asking for strength to face whatever revelations lay ahead. I prayed for wisdom to make the right choices when the time came, and for courage to protect those I loved, no matter what truths the future might reveal. In the kitchen, the old clock chimed the quarter hour, its familiar rhythm a comfort against the strangeness of the night. Soon Thomas would return from his work at the telegraph office, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he climbed to the room he shared with his sister. I would listen to him moving about quietly, ever mindful of Eleanor's rest, and I would find peace in the knowledge that both my children were safe beneath my roof for another night. How many nights had I wondered about their origins as I listened to them settle into sleep? How many times had I studied their faces by candlelight, searching for clues I feared to find? Thomas, with his dark hair and thoughtful manner, his books of poetry and philosophy that spoke to a mind educated far beyond what I could provide. Eleanor, with her ethereal beauty and gentle spirit, her unconscious grace that suggested dancing masters and deportment lessons I had never been able to afford. Both of them were so clearly born to a station far above the humble life I could provide, yet they had never complained or expressed dissatisfaction with their circumstances. They had embraced the life we built together with genuine gratitude and love, treating me with the respect and affection due to any mother. Yet sometimes I caught them staring out the windows with expressions of longing, as though they sensed something missing without being able to name what it might be. Now, as the fog pressed ever closer to our windows and the gaslight flickered uncertainly in the street beyond, I understood that the past was not content to remain buried. It had taken the form of a man who could not be there, who watched my children with the desperate love of someone who had lost everything, and who looked at me with eyes that held secrets I was not certain I wanted to uncover. But uncover them I would, for love demands courage, and I had loved Thomas and Eleanor too long and too well to let fear guide my choices now. Whatever storm was coming, whatever truth lay hidden in the shadows of memory and grief, I would face it, as I had faced everything else in my life, with determination, with hope, and with the unshakable belief that love, in the end, was stronger than any force that sought to tear it apart. The ghost, for I could call him nothing else, had begun something that night that would not end until every secret was revealed and every debt of the heart was paid in full. As I finally rose from my chair and gathered my sewing materials, preparing to seek my own rest, I felt the weight of destiny settling around my shoulders like a cloak. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new challenges, and perhaps new revelations about the mysterious man who had appeared in my parlor like an answer to prayers I had never dared to utter. But tonight, I would hold close the memory of those storm-gray eyes and the way they had looked at me as though I were something precious beyond measure, something worth crossing the boundaries between life and death to find. Sleep eluded me that night as surely as shadows flee before the morning sun. I lay in my narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of our house settling into stillness, yet my mind refused to grant me the peace I so desperately needed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him again, that impossible man with his storm-gray gaze and aristocratic bearing, watching Eleanor with such profound love that it made my heart ache with sympathetic pain. When dawn finally crept through my curtains, painting the modest room in shades of pearl and rose, I rose with a weariness that had settled deep into my bones. The morning light seemed different somehow, as though the events of the previous evening had altered the very quality of illumination that touched our home. I dressed quickly in my brown wool working dress, the one with the practical pockets for my sewing tools, and descended to the kitchen to begin the day's routine. Eleanor was already awake, standing before the small mirror in the kitchen as she arranged her golden hair into the severe style required for her interview. Her movements were precise and graceful, each pin placed with the unconscious skill of a lady's maid who had trained in the finest houses. Where had she learned such refinement? I had certainly never taught her the subtle art of creating elegance from simplicity, yet she possessed an innate understanding of style that spoke to breeding far above our circumstances. "Good morning, Mother," she said, turning to greet me with a smile that could have illuminated the darkest corners of London. Her green eyes sparkled with excitement and nervous energy, and I felt a familiar swell of pride at the young woman she had become. Today might very well mark the beginning of her rise in the world, the first step toward claiming the position in society that her natural grace and intelligence deserved. I bustled about preparing breakfast, grateful for the familiar rhythm of domestic tasks that helped ground me in the ordinary world. The bacon sizzled in the pan while I sliced bread and set the kettle to boil for tea. These simple acts of nurturing had always brought me comfort, reminding me of my purpose and place in the lives of the two souls who had become my everything. Thomas appeared as I was ladling porridge into our best china bowls, his dark hair still tousled from sleep and his shirt sleeves rolled up as he prepared to wash at the basin. He had inherited his father's height, I realized with a start, though I had no memory of ever thinking about their unknown father before. The ghostly visitor had awakened questions that lay dormant for 21 years, and now I found myself studying every detail of my children's appearance with new eyes. "You look tired, Mother," Thomas observed, his voice carrying that note of gentle concern that had characterized him since childhood. He had always been sensitive to the moods of others, perhaps even more so than Eleanor, though he expressed his caring in quiet, practical ways rather than with demonstrations of emotion. I dismissed his worry with a smile I hoped appeared more convincing than it felt. "Mrs. Henderson's wedding gown required some delicate work last evening, nothing more. But tell me, are you prepared for your examination at the law offices today?" For Thomas, too, had secured an opportunity that might change his future. Mr. Pemberton's law firm had agreed to consider him for a clerk position, a chance that could lead to articles and eventually to the bar if he proved himself capable. It was a path that required education and refinement, qualities that Thomas possessed in abundance despite our modest circumstances. Like Eleanor, he seemed to carry within himself knowledge and bearing that I had never consciously imparted. As we shared our simple breakfast, I found myself memorizing every detail of their faces as though I were seeing them clearly for the first time. Eleanor's delicate features spoke of generations of aristocratic breeding, while Thomas possessed the strong jaw and noble bearing of a man born to command. How had I never noticed the way they held themselves, the unconscious assumption of quality that marked their every movement? They were my children, yet they were also something more, something that belonged to a world I could never enter. After they departed for their respective appointments, Eleanor to her interview and Thomas to his examination, I was left alone in our quiet house with my thoughts and fears. The silence felt oppressive, charged with the memory of the previous night's supernatural encounter. I attempted to lose myself in the intricate beadwork of Mrs. Henderson's gown, but my fingers trembled and my concentration wandered. The ivory silk seemed to shimmer with an inner light that reminded me uncomfortably of the ethereal quality that had surrounded my ghostly visitor. It was then that I heard the footsteps. They came from above, from the room that Thomas and Eleanor shared, slow and deliberate and completely impossible. Both my children were away, and no one else possessed a key to our home. I sat frozen in my chair, the needle suspended in my nerveless fingers, as the sounds continued with measured precision. Someone or something was walking about in the chamber directly above my head, moving with the confident stride of a person familiar with the space. I forced myself to rise, though my legs felt unsteady beneath me, and made my way to the narrow staircase that led to the upper floor. Each step creaked beneath my feet, the familiar sounds now seeming ominous in the strange atmosphere that had settled over our home. As I climbed, the temperature began to drop, just as it had the night before, and I could see my breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The door to Thomas and Eleanor's room stood slightly ajar, though I was certain Eleanor had closed it firmly upon leaving. Beyond the gap I could see movement, the shadow of a figure passing back and forth before the window that overlooked our small garden. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed my palm against the cool wood of the door and slowly pushed it open. He stood with his back to me, studying the collection of books that lined Thomas's modest shelf. In the gray morning light that filtered through the lace curtains, he appeared more solid than he had the previous evening, though still possessed of that unsettling quality that marked him as something other than mortal. His dark hair caught the wan illumination, and I could see the expensive cut of his clothing more clearly now, the perfect tailoring that spoke of London's finest establishments. As though sensing my presence, he turned slowly to face me, and I found myself looking once again into those storm-gray eyes that held such depths of sorrow and longing. In the daylight, I could see additional details that had been hidden by shadows and candlelight. His face bore the refined features of aristocratic breeding, with a strong jaw and aquiline nose that spoke to generations of noble blood. Yet there were lines of suffering etched around his eyes and mouth, marks of pain that seemed to have been carved by experiences too terrible to comprehend. "Margaret," he said, and his voice was like velvet over steel, cultured and commanding, yet underlaid with an anguish that made my heart clench with sympathy. The sound of my name spoken by his lips sent shivers through my entire being, for it carried a familiarity that should not have existed between strangers. "You know my name," I whispered, though speaking seemed to require tremendous effort. The words emerged as barely more than a breath, yet in the supernatural quiet that surrounded us, they rang with perfect clarity. He moved toward me then, his steps silent against the wooden floor, and I found myself unable to retreat, despite every instinct that screamed for me to flee. There was something magnetic about his presence, a pull that drew me closer, even as my rational mind rebelled against the impossibility of his existence. When he stopped mere inches from where I stood, I could smell the sandalwood and bergamot that seemed to cling to him like an earthly memory of life. "I have known your name for 21 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion that seemed to struggle against the barriers between life and death. "I have watched over you and my children from the shadows, unable to speak, unable to touch, unable to express the gratitude that fills whatever remains of my soul." "Your children," I repeated, though I had known with certainty from the moment I first saw him that he was connected to Thomas and Eleanor in some profound way. The way he looked at them, with such desperate love and pride, could only belong to a father's heart. His form wavered slightly, like heat rising from summer pavement, and for a moment I feared he would fade away again before I could learn the truth. But he steadied himself with what appeared to be considerable effort, his aristocratic features becoming more solid and defined as he fought to maintain his presence in my world. "Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenshollow," he said, inclining his head in a bow that spoke to centuries of noble breeding. "And you, dear Margaret, are the woman who saved my children when I could not, who gave them love and safety and all the care that I failed to provide. The Duke of Ravenshollow." Even I, with my humble origins and limited knowledge of society, had heard whispers of that ancient title. The family was said to be one of the oldest in England, with bloodlines that traced back to the Norman conquest. Their estate in the Lake District was legendary for its beauty and grandeur, while their London residence was rumored to be among the most magnificent in all of Mayfair. Yet here stood the Duke himself, or what remained of him, acknowledging me as though I were his equal, rather than a woman so far beneath his station as to be invisible. "How did you die?" The question escaped my lips before I could consider the impropriety of asking such a thing. But Adrian, for I found I could think of him by no other name, did not seem offended by my directness. Instead, his expression grew even more sorrowful, if such a thing were possible, and his form flickered again as though the memory itself caused him pain. "Murder," he said simply, the single word carrying such weight of anguish that I felt tears spring to my eyes. I was killed on the night my children disappeared, the night you found them in your mercy and took them to your heart. The same storm that brought them to your door also brought my death, and I have spent 21 years trapped between worlds, unable to rest while my beloved children grew up beyond my reach. I sank down upon Thomas's narrow bed, my legs no longer able to support me as the implications of his revelation struck me with full force. Someone had murdered the Duke of Ravenshollow and stolen his children, leaving 2 innocent babes to die in the storm rather than reveal their identities. Yet Providence had intervened in the form of my own sleepless wandering, for I had been unable to rest that night and had ventured out despite the terrible weather. Who? I managed to whisper, though I was not certain I truly wanted to know the answer. Who would commit such terrible crimes? Adrian's face hardened, his aristocratic features taking on an expression of such controlled fury that I shrank back despite knowing he could not harm me. My brother, he said, and the words seemed torn from his very essence. Charles Blackthorne, who stood to inherit everything if I died without legitimate heirs. He arranged my death and the disappearance of my children, believing them lost forever in the storm. But you, Margaret, you saved them from his evil intentions, though neither of us knew it at the time. The room seemed to spin around me as I struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what he was telling me. Thomas and Eleanor were not merely the children of some unnamed aristocrat. They were the rightful heirs to one of England's greatest ducal houses. They possessed not only noble blood, but claims to vast estates, enormous wealth, and social position beyond anything I had ever imagined. And I, a simple seamstress from the humblest origins, had raised them in ignorance of their true inheritance. They must never know, I said, the words emerging with desperate urgency. Whatever else happens, they must never learn of this. The danger, the target it would place upon their backs, the way it would change everything they believe about themselves and their place in the world. But Adrian shook his head, his expression gentle yet implacable. The time for hiding is past, dear Margaret. Charles believes himself secure in his usurped title and wealth, but he has never stopped searching for any trace of my children. His agents have been making inquiries, following rumors, investigating every foundling and orphan in London. It is only a matter of time before he discovers them, and when he does, he did not need to finish the thought. If Charles Blackthorne had been willing to murder his own brother and arrange the death of innocent children, he would not hesitate to eliminate any threat to his stolen position. Thomas and Eleanor would be in mortal danger the moment their identities became known, yet they would also be vulnerable in their ignorance if enemies moved against them without warning. What would you have me do? I asked, though I already knew that my peaceful existence was ending, that the quiet life I had built with my beloved children was about to be shattered forever. I have no weapons against such powerful forces, no influence or connections that could protect them from a man who commands wealth and position. Adrian moved closer, and though I knew he possessed no physical substance, I felt the warmth of his presence like a caress against my cheek. You have something far more powerful than wealth or position, he said, his voice soft with wonder and admiration. You have love, pure and selfless, and stronger than any force in heaven or earth. That love saved them once, and it will be their salvation again. As he spoke, his form began to fade despite his obvious struggle to remain visible. The morning light grew stronger, streaming through the window with increasing intensity, and I realized that whatever force allowed him to manifest was weakening with the strengthening day. But before he disappeared entirely, he reached out as though to touch my face, and for one impossible moment, I felt the ghost of warmth against my skin. I will come to you again when I can, he whispered, his voice already growing distant and hollow. There is so much more you must know, so much I need to tell you about their heritage and the dangers that surround them. But know this, Margaret Whitmore, you are not alone in this fight. My love for you and my children transcends death itself, and I will find a way to help you protect them, no matter what forces stand against us. Then he was gone, leaving only the scent of sandalwood and bergamot and the echo of promises that seemed to hang in the air like half-remembered music. I sat alone in the sudden quiet, my mind reeling with revelations that changed everything I thought I knew about my children and myself. They were not orphans after all, but the rightful heirs to a great fortune, children whose very existence threatened the ambitions of a murderous usurper. The sound of the front door opening brought me back to the present with a start. Eleanor's voice called up the stairs, bright with excitement and success, and I realized that hours had passed while I sat lost in contemplation of Adrian's revelations. I rose quickly, smoothing my skirts and attempting to compose myself before going down to hear about her interview. "Mother," she called, "I have the most wonderful news. Madame Rousseau has accepted me for the position, and I am to begin work on Monday. She says I have natural style and grace that cannot be taught, and she believes I will do very well in her establishment." I embraced her warmly, genuinely delighted by her success, even as my heart ached with the knowledge of how much her life was about to change. She was radiant with happiness, her green eyes sparkling with dreams of the future, and I could not bear to dim her joy with talk of ghosts and hidden dangers. There would be time enough for such conversations when Thomas returned, and I could speak to them both together. Thomas arrived shortly after noon, equally triumphant, for Mr. Pemberton had been impressed with his knowledge of legal principles and his natural bearing. He was to begin as a clerk the following week, with the understanding that if he proved himself capable, he might eventually be considered for articles. Both my children had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, yet I knew their achievements were merely the first steps toward claiming their true inheritance. That evening, as we sat around our modest table sharing a celebratory dinner, I studied their faces with new understanding. The aristocratic line of Eleanor's features, the natural authority in Thomas's bearing, the unconscious elegance that marked their every movement, all spoke to the noble blood that flowed in their veins. They were Duke Adrian's children in every line of their faces, every gesture of their hands, every note of their cultured voices. Yet they were also mine, the children of my heart, if not my body, raised with my values and shaped by my love. Whatever revelations the future might bring, whatever dangers might threaten them, that truth would remain unchanged. I was their mother in every way that mattered, and I would protect them with my life if necessary. As the evening wore on, and we spoke of their hopes and plans for the future, I found myself watching the shadows in the corners of our parlor, searching for any sign of Adrian's return. The questions he had raised burned in my mind like unquenchable flames. How had he died? What specific dangers threatened my children? And most pressingly, how could I hope to protect them from enemies who commanded vast resources and held positions of power throughout English society? When Thomas and Eleanor finally retired for the night, I remained in my chair by the dying fire, my sewing forgotten in my lap as I contemplated the impossible task that lay before me. I was a seamstress, a woman of humble origins with no connections to the world of power and privilege. Yet somehow I would have to find a way to keep my children safe from forces that had already proven themselves capable of murder and conspiracy on the grandest scale. The clock struck midnight, and in the distance I heard the mournful cry of foghorns from the Thames. London slept around us, unaware that in one modest house in an unremarkable street, a woman sat awake planning to challenge the established order of society itself. For love of two children who were not hers by birth, but were hers by every law of the heart, I would find the courage to face whatever came next, and perhaps, if fate was kind, I would not have to face it alone. The memory of Adrian's storm-gray eyes and the promise in his voice gave me hope that transcended reason. Death had not been able to silence his love for his children or diminish his desire to protect them. If a ghost could cross the boundaries between worlds for love, then surely a mortal woman could find the strength to stand against earthly enemies, no matter how powerful they might be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new revelations, and perhaps new dangers. But tonight, my children slept safely in their beds, unaware that their entire world was about to change. For now, that was enough. I had been their guardian for 21 years, and I would continue to guard them for as long as breath remained in my body or love beat in my heart. The fire collapsed into glowing embers, and finally I rose to seek my rest, knowing that sleep would bring me no peace, but hoping that morning might bring me wisdom. In my dreams, I would search for answers to impossible questions and strength to face unimaginable trials. But in my heart, I carried the memory of a father's love and the promise that even death could not diminish the bonds that united us all. The following weeks passed in a strange suspension between the ordinary and the impossible, as though I existed in two worlds simultaneously. By day, I maintained the familiar rhythms of our domestic life, while Thomas and Eleanor settled into their new positions with remarkable success. Eleanor had quickly become Madame Rousseau's most trusted assistant, her natural elegance and intuitive understanding of fashion making her indispensable to the clientele of refined ladies who frequented the Bond Street establishment. Thomas, meanwhile, had impressed Mr. Pemberton with his quick grasp of legal principles and his ability to draft correspondence with the precision and eloquence of a gentleman born to the profession. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, I lived in constant anticipation of Adrian's return. Each evening, as shadows lengthened across our parlor and the gaslight flickered against the advancing darkness, I found myself searching every corner for signs of his presence. The very air seemed charged with possibility, as though the boundaries between the world of the living and whatever realm he inhabited had grown thin around our modest home. It was on a foggy Tuesday evening in December, as London wrapped itself in its familiar shroud of yellow mist, that he came to me again. I was alone, having sent Thomas and Eleanor to a concert at St. James's Hall with money I could ill afford, but felt they deserved after their recent successes. They had protested my generosity, but I insisted, knowing with growing certainty that such simple pleasures might soon become impossible once the truth of their heritage was revealed. I sat by the window in our small parlor, ostensibly working on a commission for Lady Pemberton, though my attention wandered constantly to the fog-shrouded street beyond. The delicate embroidery lay forgotten in my lap when the familiar chill began to permeate the room, and I looked up to find Adrian materializing near the mantelpiece with greater clarity than I had yet witnessed. In the warm glow of the firelight, he appeared almost solid, his aristocratic features defined with startling precision. The expensive cut of his evening clothes was immaculate, from the pristine white of his shirt front to the perfect drape of his black tailcoat. Yet it was his eyes that captured my attention most completely, those storm-gray depths that held such profound emotion that I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Margaret," he said, and the way he spoke my name had become like a caress, intimate and warm despite the supernatural divide between us. "I have been searching for a way to show you the truth of what happened on the night I died, and at last I have found the means. Will you trust me enough to see what I have seen, to experience the memories that have tormented me for 21 years? I rose from my chair without hesitation, drawn by something deeper than mere curiosity. The need to understand his suffering, to share his burden in whatever way possible, outweighed any fear of the unknown. "Yes," I whispered, stepping closer until I stood within arm's reach of his ghostly form. "Show me everything." He extended his hand toward me, and though I knew it possessed no physical substance, I reached out to meet his gesture. The moment our fingers would have touched, the world around me dissolved into swirling mist, and I found myself standing in an elegantly appointed library that bore no resemblance to any room in our humble home. The transformation was so complete and startling that I gasped aloud, spinning around to take in my surroundings with wonder and growing alarm. Rich mahogany shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that spoke to generations of learning and culture. A fire crackled in an ornate marble fireplace, while oil paintings in gilded frames depicted landscapes of breathtaking beauty and portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose aristocratic bearing was unmistakable. "You are seeing Raven's Hollow House as it was on the night of November 23, 1866, Adrian said, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "This is my library, where I spent my final hours as a living man, unaware that death stalked the very halls of my own home. The scene began to shift and move around me like a living painting, and I watched with fascination and growing horror as the events of that terrible night unfolded before my eyes. A younger Adrian entered the library, perhaps 20 years of age, carrying 2 small bundles that I recognized with a shock of recognition as infant Thomas and Eleanor. Even as babies, their resemblance to their father was unmistakable, and I felt my heart clench with maternal tenderness at the sight of their tiny, perfect faces. The young Duke moved with urgent purpose, wrapping his children in the finest cashmere before placing them in a leather traveling case that he had lined with silk. His movements spoke of desperate haste, yet his touch remained gentle as he kissed each small forehead and whispered words of love and protection that brought tears to my eyes. Why was he preparing to take them away? I asked, though I was not certain Adrian could hear me in this strange realm between memory and vision. Because I had discovered my brother's plan, came his reply, heavy with anguish. Charles had been poisoning my food slowly for months, believing that my death from apparent illness would raise fewer questions than more violent means. But I had grown suspicious of my increasing weakness and had my physician conduct secret examinations. When I learned the truth, I also discovered that Charles intended to eliminate my children once I was dead, to ensure his inheritance was secure. The vision continued, and I watched as the younger Adrian carried his precious bundles through the corridors of his magnificent home, moving with the stealth of a man who understood that discovery meant death. The house was dark, save for occasional candles, and the storm that raged beyond the windows seemed to echo the tumult in my own heart. Lightning illuminated the grand staircase and elegant furnishings, creating a dramatic backdrop for this desperate flight. I had arranged passage to America, Adrian continued, his voice growing more strained as the memory intensified. My children would be safe there, raised by a family I trusted, while I remained to face Charles and expose his crimes. But I underestimated both his cunning and his ruthlessness. The scene shifted abruptly to the grand foyer of Ravenshollow House, where the younger Adrian was met by a group of men whose faces were hidden in shadow. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched them surround him, their intentions clear despite their attempts at concealment. Adrian fought valiantly, but he was weakened by months of slow poisoning and outnumbered by his attackers. "Take the children to the appointed place," one of the shadowy figures commanded, his voice cultured yet cold. "Let the storm finish what we have begun. No one will question the disappearance of foundlings in such weather." "No!" the younger Adrian cried out, struggling against the hands that held him. "They are innocent! I beg you, whatever you do to me, let them live." But his pleas fell on deaf ears as the men seized the traveling case containing his precious children and disappeared into the storm-lashed night. I watched in horror as Adrian was dragged back into the library where Charles Blackthorne waited with a smile of such malicious satisfaction that I shuddered with revulsion. Charles was a man of perhaps 30 years, bearing a superficial resemblance to his brother, but lacking entirely the nobility and warmth that characterized Adrian's countenance. His features were sharp and calculating, his pale eyes holding a coldness that spoke to the absence of any human feeling. He was dressed in perfect evening attire, as though attending a social gathering rather than orchestrating the murder of his own family. "Hello, brother," Charles said, his voice dripping with false cordiality. "I trust you have said your farewells to those precious children of yours. They will not trouble us much longer." "You monster," Adrian gasped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth where one of the attackers had struck him. "They are your blood as well, your own nephew and niece. How can you contemplate such evil?" Charles laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humanity. "Blood means nothing when weighed against a ducal coronet and an estate worth £500,000, dear brother. I have waited far too long to claim what should have been mine from birth. Your children are merely obstacles to be removed, just as you are." The scene that followed was too terrible for me to watch in its entirety, yet I found myself unable to look away as Charles revealed the full extent of his plotting. He had not only arranged Adrian's slow poisoning, but had also corrupted several servants and hired men to ensure that no evidence of his crimes would remain. The storm that raged outside was to provide cover for his evil work, washing away any trace of what had transpired within those elegant walls. As Adrian's life ebbed away in that beautiful library, surrounded by the books and treasures that represented centuries of family history, his final thoughts were not of his own approaching death, but of the children who were even then being carried into the tempest. I felt his anguish as though it were my own, the desperate love of a father who had failed to protect those dearest to his heart. But Charles had underestimated the power of Providence and the mercy of strangers. The men he had sent to dispose of the children had abandoned them at the first sign of difficulty, leaving them outside the parish church where I happened to be walking despite the terrible weather. What Charles intended as murder became instead a miracle of preservation. Though neither Adrian nor I understood it at the time, the vision began to fade, the elegant library dissolving back into our humble parlor, and I found myself standing once again before Adrian's ghostly form. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I absorbed the full horror of what I had witnessed, yet there was also a fierce joy in my heart at the knowledge that his children had survived and thrived despite their uncle's evil intentions. "Now you understand," Adrian said, his voice heavy with the weight of 21 years of helpless observation. "Charles believes himself secure in his stolen title and wealth, but he has never stopped searching for any trace of my children. His agents have been making inquiries throughout London, following every rumor and investigating every foundling home and orphanage. It is only a matter of time before he discovers them." The implications of his words struck me with the force of a physical blow. Thomas and Eleanor were not merely heirs to a great fortune. They were living threats to a man who had already proven himself capable of murder. Every day they remained ignorant of their heritage was another day of danger, yet revealing the truth would make them even more vulnerable to their uncle's machinations. "What would you have me do?" I asked, though my heart already knew the answer. "I am but a simple seamstress with no connections to the world of power and influence. How can I hope to protect them from such a formidable enemy?" Adrian moved closer, and I felt the now familiar chill that accompanied his presence intensify into something warmer, more comforting. "You have already done the impossible, my dear Margaret," he said, his voice soft with wonder and admiration. "You saved them when all seemed lost, raised them with love and wisdom, and shaped them into the remarkable individuals they have become. Your strength and devotion have already proven greater than Charles's evil." But I felt far from strong as I contemplated the magnitude of the task before me. Charles Blackthorne commanded vast resources, held positions of influence throughout London society, and had demonstrated his willingness to use any means necessary to protect his stolen inheritance. What weapons did I possess against such power except love and determination? "There is something else you must know," Adrian continued, his form beginning to waver as the effort of maintaining such extended contact took its toll. "I have not been entirely powerless during these years of watching and waiting. My love for you and my children has given me abilities that transcend the normal limitations of death. I can influence small things, move objects, even appear to others when the need is great enough." As he spoke, I noticed that the fire in our grate had grown brighter without any addition of coal, and the gas lamps seemed to burn with unusual steadiness despite the December wind that rattled our windows. Even in death, his love had found ways to provide comfort and protection, small gestures that spoke to the depth of his devotion. "You have been watching over us all these years," I realized, my voice thick with emotion. "The times when Eleanor was ill as a child and recovered so quickly. The way Thomas always seemed to find just the right books at the lending library. The commissions that came to me whenever our funds grew low. You have been our guardian angel." His smile was radiant despite the sorrow that never left his aristocratic features. "Love finds a way," he said simply. "It transcends death, defies the laws of nature, and creates miracles where none should be possible. That is what you gave my children when you took them to your heart, Margaret, and that is what I give to you now in return." The sound of voices in the street outside reminded me that Thomas and Eleanor would soon return from their evening at the concert hall, and I realized that our supernatural conference must end. Yet there was still so much I needed to know, so many questions that burned in my mind like unquenchable flames. "How will I know when the danger is imminent?" I asked urgently. "How can I prepare them for a truth that will shatter everything they believe about their lives and their place in the world?" "Trust your instincts," Adrian replied, his voice already growing faint as his form became increasingly transparent. "You have guided them safely for 21 years through intuition and love. Those same qualities will serve you now in the trials to come. And remember, you are not alone in this fight. My love surrounds you always, and when the moment of greatest peril arrives, I will find a way to stand beside you." Then he was gone, leaving only the lingering scent of sandalwood and bergamot and a warmth in my heart that had nothing to do with the fire in our grate. I sank into my chair, my mind reeling with visions of murder and betrayal, yet also filled with a strange sense of peace. The truth was terrible, yet it was also liberating. No longer did I need to wonder about my children's origins or fear the unknown. The enemy had a face and a name, and though Charles Blackthorne was powerful beyond my ability to challenge directly, he was also mortal and fallible. The front door opened with its familiar squeal of hinges, and I heard Thomas and Eleanor's voices as they climbed the stairs to our parlor. Their conversation was animated and joyful as they discussed the evening's entertainment, and I felt my heart swell with love and pride at the remarkable young people they had become. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever dangers threatened them from the shadows of their past, they possessed strength and nobility that would serve them well in the battles to come. "Good evening, Mother," Eleanor called as she entered the parlor, her cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. The concert was absolutely magnificent. Mr. Pemberton's cousin is a violinist of extraordinary talent, and the compositions were unlike anything we have ever heard. Thomas followed close behind, his dark eyes bright with intellectual pleasure. The musicians performed several pieces by a young German composer whose work challenges conventional musical structure in fascinating ways, he added, settling into his favorite chair by the fire. It made me think about how art can transcend the boundaries of tradition and create entirely new forms of beauty. As they shared their enthusiasm for the evening's entertainment, I found myself studying their faces with new understanding. The passion for beauty and culture that animated their conversation was part of their noble heritage, an inheritance of taste and refinement that had manifested despite their humble upbringing. They were Duke Adrian's children in every gesture, every turn of phrase, every moment of unconscious elegance. Yet they were also mine, shaped by my values and my love, grounded in the practical realities of working life, yet elevated by dreams of something greater. When the time came to reveal their true identities, I prayed that the foundation I had given them would prove strong enough to bear the weight of such momentous knowledge. The evening passed in familiar companionship, with Thomas reading aloud from a volume of poetry, while Eleanor and I worked on our respective sewing projects. The domestic tranquility was precious beyond measure, yet I could not shake the awareness that such peaceful moments were numbered. Change was coming, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons, and with it would come challenges that would test every bond of love and loyalty we had built together. When they finally retired for the night, I remained by the dying fire, my mind racing with plans and preparations. Tomorrow I would begin making discreet inquiries about the current Duke of Ravenshollow, learning what I could about Charles Blackthorne and his activities. If he was indeed searching for Thomas and Eleanor, then I needed to understand his methods and anticipate his moves. More importantly, I needed to begin preparing my children for the revelations that lay ahead. They deserved to know the truth about their heritage, yet that knowledge would also place them in mortal danger. The timing of such a revelation would require the utmost care and wisdom, for once spoken, such words could never be unsaid. As the clock struck midnight and London settled into the quiet hours of deepest night, I whispered a prayer for strength and guidance to whatever powers governed love and justice. In my heart, I carried Adrian's promise that I would not face the coming trials alone, and in my soul, I nurtured the fierce determination that had enabled me to save his children once before. The ghost of the Duke of Ravenshollow had trusted me with his most precious treasures 21 years ago, though neither of us knew it at the time. Now he was trusting me again, this time with full knowledge of what was at stake. I would not fail him, or them, or the love that bound us all together across the boundaries between life and death. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight my children slept safely in their beds, protected by love stronger than any earthly force. The danger I had sensed approaching materialized with terrifying swiftness just 3 days before Christmas. I was in the kitchen preparing our modest holiday meal when Eleanor burst through the front door, her usually composed demeanor shattered by what appeared to be genuine terror. Her golden hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, and her green eyes were wide with an emotion I had rarely seen in my gentle daughter. "Mother," she gasped, rushing to my side with unusual urgency. "There was a gentleman at Madame Rousseau's shop today, asking questions about me. He knew things, Mother, things about my appearance and manner that no stranger should know. Madame Rousseau was quite uncomfortable with his inquiries and told him that employee information was confidential, but he was most persistent." My blood turned to ice in my veins as I absorbed the implications of her words. The moment I had dreaded for 21 years had finally arrived, and I found myself woefully unprepared despite Adrian's warnings. I set down the wooden spoon I had been using to stir the pudding and turned to face Eleanor fully, my mind racing with the need to protect her while also gathering as much information as possible. "Tell me everything," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the panic that threatened to overwhelm my rational thought. "What did this gentleman look like? What precisely did he ask?" Eleanor sank into one of our kitchen chairs, her hands trembling as she struggled to compose herself. He was perhaps 40 years of age, well dressed in the manner of a wealthy gentleman, with pale eyes and sharp features. He claimed to be conducting inquiries on behalf of a family seeking a long-lost relative, but there was something in his manner that frightened me terribly. He asked about my parentage, about how long I had been in your care, and whether I had any distinguishing marks or characteristics. The description sent chills of recognition through my entire being, for though I had never seen Charles Blackthorne in life, his appearance in Adrian's shared memories was burned into my consciousness. The pale, calculating eyes and sharp features Eleanor described matched perfectly with the man I had watched orchestrate his brother's murder and the attempted elimination of 2 innocent children. What distinguishing marks did he ask about specifically? I pressed, though I feared I already knew the answer. The infant Eleanor had possessed a small birthmark on her left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon, and visible only when she wore low-necked gowns. I had thought little of it over the years, but now I understood it might serve as definitive proof of her identity. "A birthmark," Eleanor whispered, her hand rising unconsciously to touch her left shoulder through the fabric of her dress. He asked if I had a crescent-shaped mark just here, and when Madame Rousseau refused to answer, he offered her a substantial sum of money for the information. She declined, but Mother, I could see the temptation in her eyes. We are not such valuable customers that her loyalty is guaranteed against sufficient financial inducement. I felt the world tilting around me as the full gravity of our situation became clear. Charles Blackthorne had not only located Eleanor, but possessed specific knowledge that would allow him to identify her beyond any doubt. The net was closing around my beloved children, and I had perhaps hours rather than days to act before their uncle moved to eliminate them permanently. "Where is Thomas?" I asked, struggling to keep the desperation from my voice. "Has he encountered any strange inquiries at Mr. Pemberton's office?" As if summoned by my words, the front door opened and Thomas entered with his usual measured tread. Yet one look at his face told me that he too had experienced something troubling. His dark eyes held a wariness that had not been there when he departed for work that morning, and his movements carried a tension that spoke to some internal alarm he could not quite identify. "Mother," he said, pausing in the doorway as he took in our obviously distressed states. "I had the strangest encounter this afternoon. A gentleman appeared at the law offices claiming to be researching property disputes involving foundlings and orphans. He asked Mr. Pemberton several questions about my background, and though my employer disclosed nothing specific, I could not shake the feeling that the man already knew more about me than he revealed. My worst fears were confirmed. Charles Blackthorne had located both twins and was moving swiftly to verify their identities before taking whatever action he deemed necessary. The careful life I had built for them was crumbling around us, and I realized with crystalline clarity that the time for secrets had ended. They needed to know the truth about their heritage, regardless of the dangers such knowledge would bring. "Sit down, both of you," I said, my voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "There are things you must know about your past, terrible truths I have hidden from you for your own protection. But concealment is no longer possible, and your very lives may depend upon understanding what forces move against you." They exchanged glances of growing alarm, but obeyed without question, settling into chairs around our small kitchen table. In the warm glow of the gaslight, Their aristocratic features were more pronounced than ever, and I marveled that I had been able to deceive myself for so long about their obvious noble heritage. They were Duke Adrian's children in every line of their faces, every gesture of their graceful hands. "You are not foundlings," I began, choosing my words with the care of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. "Your father was Adrian Blackthorne, 7th Duke of Ravenshollow, and you are the rightful heirs to one of England's greatest ducal houses. I found you as infants on the night your father was murdered by his younger brother, who sought to claim your inheritance for himself." The silence that greeted this revelation was so complete that I could hear the ticking of the mantel clock in our parlor and the distant rumble of carriages on the cobblestones outside. Eleanor's face had gone pale as marble, while Thomas sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that reminded me powerfully of his father's unwavering gaze. "That is impossible," Eleanor whispered finally, her voice barely more than a breath. "We are the children of a seamstress, raised in humble circumstances. How can you speak of dukes and murders as though they were part of our history?" "Because they are part of your history, my darling," I said gently, reaching across the table to take her trembling hands in mine. "I have documentary evidence hidden away, items that were with you when I found you, proof of your noble birth that I have guarded carefully for 21 years. But more than that, you have only to look in any mirror to see the aristocratic bearing that marks every movement you make." Thomas leaned forward, his legal mind already working through the implications of my words. "If what you say is true, then the current Duke of Ravenshollow is an usurper who murdered his own brother. But that would make him Charles Blackthorne, a man of considerable influence in London society. How can we hope to challenge such power with mere accusations and ancient evidence?" His question struck to the heart of our dilemma, for indeed, Charles Blackthorne had spent 21 years consolidating his stolen position and eliminating any traces of his crimes. He commanded vast wealth, held properties throughout England, and moved in the highest circles of government and society. What chance did we have against such formidable opposition? It was then that the familiar chill began to permeate our kitchen, and I watched with a mixture of relief and apprehension as Adrian began to materialize in the corner where shadows pooled deepest. His appearance was more solid and defined than I had ever witnessed, as though the presence of his children and the urgency of our situation had somehow strengthened his ability to manifest in our world. Thomas and Eleanor gasped in unison, their eyes widening with shock and disbelief as they beheld their father's ghostly form. Yet beneath the initial terror, I saw recognition dawn in their faces, an instinctive understanding that this spirit bore some profound connection to their very souls. "My beloved children," Adrian said, his voice carrying across the supernatural divide with perfect clarity, "I have watched over you for 21 years, helpless to speak or reveal myself until the moment when danger made such caution impossible. You are indeed my son and daughter, the rightful Duke and Lady of Ravenshollow, and the woman you know as mother is the angel who saved you from death and raised you with more love than any children have ever known." Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth to stifle a cry of amazement, while Thomas rose slowly from his chair, his movements careful and deliberate, as though sudden motion might cause the apparition to vanish. "Father," he whispered, the word carrying 21 years of unspoken longing and dreams he had never dared to voice. "Yes, my son," Adrian replied, his aristocratic features softening with overwhelming emotion. "You have grown into everything I hoped you would become, a man of honor and intelligence who will make a worthy duke when the time comes to claim your inheritance. And Eleanor, my precious daughter, you possess all the grace and beauty of your noble bloodline, combined with the strength and compassion that Margaret has instilled in you both." The reunion between father and children was heartbreaking in its intensity, yet also beautiful beyond description. Though Adrian could not embrace them physically, the love that flowed between them was as tangible as any earthly force. They spoke in low, urgent voices, sharing 21 years of separation in precious moments of supernatural communion. But our time for such tender reunions was limited, for even as they spoke, I became aware of new sounds from the street outside. Heavy footsteps approached our modest home with purposeful intent, accompanied by the jingle of harnesses and the creak of carriage wheels. My blood turned to ice as I realized that Charles Blackthorne had not been content to merely identify his niece and nephew. He had come to eliminate them personally, bringing sufficient force to ensure that no witnesses would survive to contradict his version of events. "They are here," Adrian said urgently, his form flickering with the intensity of his emotion. "Charles has come with hired men to finish what he began 21 years ago. You must flee, all of you, before it is too late." "But where can we go?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady despite the terror that must have been coursing through her veins. "If he commands such resources, surely he can pursue us anywhere in London." "Not anywhere," Adrian replied, his ghostly features taking on an expression of fierce determination. "There is a place where my influence is strongest, where the connection between past and present runs deepest. Ravenshollow House itself has been empty since my death, for Charles prefers his own London residence. The staff was dismissed years ago, but the house remembers, and there I can offer you protection that transcends the mortal world." The sound of voices in our front garden made immediate action imperative. I rushed to gather the few precious items I had saved from the night I found the twins, documents and jewelry that would prove their heritage beyond any doubt. Thomas collected his books, while Eleanor secured what money we possessed, their movements swift and efficient despite the supernatural circumstances that had transformed their understanding of the world. We slipped out through our back garden as the first heavy blows fell upon our front door, making our way through the maze of narrow alleys and passages that connected the working districts of London. The fog that had become our constant companion in recent weeks now served as blessed concealment, wrapping around us like a protective shroud as we moved through streets I had known since childhood. Adrian's presence accompanied us as we fled, a cold but comforting sensation that assured me we were not entirely defenseless against our pursuers. He could not fight them directly, but his love had found ways to influence the physical world in small but significant ways. Gas lamps flickered and died as we passed, plunging our route into deeper darkness, while loose stones seemed to shift beneath the feet of any who attempted to follow too closely. The journey across London took most of the night, for we were forced to take circuitous routes to avoid the main thoroughfares where Charles might have posted watchers. By dawn, we stood before the imposing gates of Ravenshollow House in Mayfair, exhausted and frightened, but alive and together. The mansion loomed before us in the gray morning light, its elegant facade speaking to centuries of power and privilege that was Thomas and Eleanor's birthright. As Adrian had promised, the house stood empty, though not abandoned. Someone had maintained the property over the years, keeping the gardens neat and the exterior in good repair. Perhaps Charles had preserved it as a monument to his successful usurpation, or perhaps some loyal servant had continued to care for the family seat, despite the absence of its rightful owners. Adrian's presence grew stronger as we approached the front entrance, his form becoming nearly solid in the place where he had lived and died. He moved ahead of us with visible emotion, his aristocratic features reflecting the complex feelings that must accompany a return to the scene of his murder. Yet there was also joy in his expression, the happiness of a man who was finally able to bring his children home. "Welcome to Ravenshollow House," he said, as we stood together in the grand foyer that I remembered from the supernatural vision he had shared with me. "This is your true home, the place where your ancestors have lived and ruled for 5 centuries. Here, you are safe under my protection, and here we will plan how to reclaim what Charles has stolen." Thomas and Eleanor moved through their ancestral home with growing wonder, their eyes taking in the magnificent tapestries and paintings that lined the walls. Despite their humble upbringing, they seemed to belong in these elegant surroundings, their natural grace and bearing marking them unmistakably as the rightful heirs to such grandeur. The library where Adrian had died had been preserved exactly as it was on that terrible night, and I watched with aching heart as he stood once more among the books and treasures he had loved in life. The pain of memory was evident in every line of his ghostly form, yet there was also a sense of completion, as though some essential circle was finally closing after 21 years of waiting. "Now, my children," Adrian said, turning to address Thomas and Eleanor with the authority of a father and a duke, "we must prepare for the battle to come. Charles will not be content with our escape, and he commands resources that make him a formidable enemy. But you are no longer helpless foundlings without name or protection. You are the rightful heirs to this house and title, and it is time to claim your inheritance. The transformation in both Thomas and Eleanor was remarkable to witness. Confronted with their true heritage and the magnificent home that was rightfully theirs, they seemed to grow taller, their bearing taking on the unconscious authority that came with noble blood. They were still the children I had raised with love and care, but they were also something more now, aristocrats who would not be easily cowed by threats or intimidation. "What must we do, Father?" Eleanor asked, her voice carrying a new note of determination that reminded me powerfully of Adrian's own strength of will. "How do we expose Charles's crimes and reclaim our rightful place?" Adrian smiled then, and in that expression I saw reflected all the love and pride that had sustained him through 21 years of supernatural existence. The plan he outlined was complex and dangerous, requiring careful coordination and no small amount of courage. But as I listened to father and children discuss strategy with growing confidence, I felt hope bloom in my heart for the first time since this terrible affair began. We were no longer alone in our struggle against the usurper Duke. We had truth on our side, and love, and the supernatural protection of a father's devotion that transcended death itself. Charles Blackthorne had grown complacent in his stolen position, believing his crimes safely buried in the past. He was about to discover that some secrets refuse to remain hidden, and that love, once awakened, possesses power beyond any earthly force. The battle for the Ravenshollow inheritance was about to begin, and though the outcome remained uncertain, I knew that whatever happened, we would face it together. The seamstress, the ghost, and the children who were heirs to a dukedom, united by bonds stronger than blood and deeper than death itself. In the end, perhaps that would be enough to see justice done and love triumphant over the darkest of human ambitions. The final confrontation came on New Year's Eve, as the bells of London prepared to ring in the year 1888. Charles Blackthorne arrived at Ravenshollow House with a small army of hired men, confident in his ability to eliminate the last threats to his usurped position. Yet he had not reckoned with the supernatural forces that guarded the rightful heirs, nor with the determination of a woman whose maternal love had already proven stronger than death itself. I stood in the grand foyer beside Thomas and Eleanor, watching through the tall windows as Charles's carriages approached through the winter twilight. My children had spent the past week transforming themselves from humble working people into the aristocrats they were born to be, studying the family histories and legal documents that would support their claim while learning to command the authority that was their birthright. Adrian had been their constant guide and teacher, his presence growing stronger with each passing day as his children accepted their true heritage. Now, as we prepared to face the man who had murdered their father and stolen their inheritance, they stood with the bearing of a duke and a lady, their noble blood finally claiming its proper expression. Thomas wore one of his father's evening suits, preserved in the Duke's chambers for 21 years, while Eleanor had chosen a gown of midnight blue silk that had belonged to their grandmother. They were magnificent in their newfound dignity, yet they remained the loving children I had raised, their affection for me unchanged despite the revelation of their exalted station. "Are you certain this plan will succeed, Father?" Eleanor asked, her green eyes reflecting both determination and the natural anxiety of a young woman about to face mortal danger. "Charles has shown himself capable of any evil in pursuit of his ambitions." Adrian materialized fully beside us, his ghostly form more solid and defined than ever before. The approaching climax of his long quest for justice seemed to have strengthened his connection to the mortal world, allowing him to manifest with startling clarity and presence. He was dressed as he had been on the night of his death, in perfect evening attire that proclaimed his aristocratic heritage, yet his face now bore an expression of such fierce determination that even I, who had come to love him deeply, felt a shiver of awe at the power he commanded. "Trust in love, my daughter," he said, his voice carrying the authority of both a father and a duke. "Charles believes himself secure because he has never understood the forces he truly faces. He sees only a frightened seamstress and 2 foundlings who threaten his stolen position. He does not comprehend that love has bound us together across the boundaries of life and death, creating power that transcends any earthly consideration. As if summoned by our conversation, the sound of heavy boots echoed from the front steps, followed by the imperious rapping of knuckles against the great oak doors. Charles Blackthorne had come to finish what he began 21 years ago, but this time he would face not helpless infants, but the rightful heirs to the Ravenshollow legacy, protected by their father's undying devotion and their mother's fierce courage. Thomas moved forward with measured dignity to answer the door, his bearing so perfectly ducal that I felt tears of pride spring to my eyes. When he pulled open the heavy portal, Charles Blackthorne stood revealed in all his calculating malevolence, flanked by 4 rough men whose faces spoke to violence as their chosen profession. Yet at the sight of Thomas, Charles himself stepped backward involuntarily, his pale eyes widening with shock at the unmistakable resemblance between nephew and murdered brother. "Impossible," Charles whispered, his aristocratic composure cracking as he beheld the living image of the man he had killed. "You cannot be here. They told me the children were dead, lost in the storm." "Then your informants served you poorly, uncle," Thomas replied with icy courtesy that would have done credit to any peer of the realm. "Thomas Blackthorne, 8th Duke of Ravenshollow, stands before you to demand an accounting for your crimes. You are a usurper and a murderer, and the time has come to answer for your evil." The transformation in Charles's expression from shock to fury was terrible to witness. His aristocratic mask fell away entirely, revealing the cold-blooded killer who had orchestrated his brother's death and the attempted murder of innocent children. His pale eyes blazed with malicious intent as he gestured to his hired thugs, commanding them to seize what he clearly regarded as mere obstacles to be eliminated. "Kill them all," he snarled, his cultured voice degenerating into something bestial and savage. "Leave no witnesses to contradict my version of events. The foundlings have served their purpose by leading me to this evidence of Adrian's survival, but now they must die as they should have died 21 years ago." The men moved forward with practiced violence, yet they had taken barely 3 steps into the foyer when the supernatural protection that guarded Ravenshollow House made itself known. The temperature plummeted with shocking suddenness, and a wind that seemed to blow from another world entirely began to howl through the corridors. The gas lamps flickered wildly before blazing with unnatural brilliance, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose and intelligence. Adrian's voice echoed through the mansion with power that transcended the mortal realm, speaking words of command that struck the intruders like physical blows. "You dare to bring violence into the home of my ancestors? You dare to threaten my children in the very halls where generations of dukes have lived and ruled? Face the judgment of the dead, brother, for your crimes have awakened forces beyond your comprehension." The hired thugs stumbled backward in terror as ghostly figures began to materialize throughout the foyer. The spirits of previous Dukes of Ravenshollow emerged from whatever realm had sheltered them, called forth by Adrian's love and the righteousness of his cause. They appeared in the clothing of their respective eras, from medieval armor to Tudor finery to Georgian elegance, yet all bore the same aristocratic features that marked the Blackthorne bloodline and the same expression of outrage at their descendants' crimes. Charles himself stood transfixed with horror as his brother's ghost advanced upon him. No longer the helpless victim of 21 years past, but a figure of supernatural authority backed by the power of centuries. The usurper duke had grown comfortable with his stolen position, believing his crimes safely buried with their victims, but now he faced the ultimate judgment of those he had wronged. "You cannot be here," Charles gasped, his voice breaking with terror as he confronted the impossible sight of his murdered brother. "The dead do not return. This is some trick, some elaborate deception designed to frighten me into confession." But Adrian's response came not in words, but in action that left no doubt as to his reality. Objects throughout the foyer began to move of their own accord, portraits trembling on their hooks while furniture slid across polished floors with supernatural force. The very air itself seemed to thicken and swirl, charged with an energy that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. "You killed me for golden titles, brother," Adrian said, his ghostly form now blazing with otherworldly light. "You poisoned me slowly and arranged the murder of my innocent children, all for the sake of worldly position that you could never truly possess. But love has preserved what you sought to destroy. and justice has waited 21 years for this moment of reckoning. The hired men had fled in terror at the first manifestation of supernatural force, abandoning their employer to face alone the consequences of his evil choices. Charles stood isolated in the center of the grand foyer, surrounded by the accusing spirits of his ancestors and confronted with the living evidence of his crimes in the persons of Thomas and Eleanor. It was then that Eleanor stepped forward, her bearing so perfectly regal that she seemed like a princess from a fairy tale. In her hands, she carried the documents I had preserved for 21 years, the proof of their noble birth and their father's murder that would expose Charles's usurpation to the world. "Charles Blackthorne," she said, her voice ringing with authority that brooked no contradiction. "I am Eleanor Blackthorne, daughter of the 7th Duke of Ravenshollow, and these documents detail your crimes in full. Your own correspondence with the hired killers, preserved by loyal servants who suspected your evil, will serve as evidence before the Queen's bench. Your stolen reign is ended." The legal proof combined with the supernatural manifestations finally broke Charles's resistance entirely. Confronted with evidence that would see him hanged for murder and usurpation, faced with the ghostly presence of the brother he had killed, he collapsed to his knees in the foyer of the house he had never rightfully possessed. His confession poured out in a torrent of fear and self-recrimination, as though the supernatural atmosphere had stripped away his ability to maintain any pretense of innocence. "Yes, I killed him," Charles cried, his aristocratic composure shattered beyond repair. "I poisoned Adrian slowly and arranged his murder when that proved insufficient. I ordered the children killed to secure my inheritance, and I have lived in fear of discovery for 21 years. But I am still the Duke by law, still protected by my position and wealth. No court will convict a peer on the testimony of foundlings and the ravings of a seamstress." His desperate words revealed the depth of his delusion, for he still believed that aristocratic privilege would shield him from the consequences of his crimes. Yet even as he spoke, the sound of carriages approaching through the winter night announced the arrival of forces he had not anticipated. Thomas had sent messages to certain legal authorities, men of integrity who would see justice done regardless of the accused's social position. Mr. Pemberton entered the foyer accompanied by a magistrate and several court officials, their faces grave with the knowledge of what they had come to witness. The supernatural manifestations had faded somewhat in the presence of mortal authority, yet Adrian's protective presence remained strong enough to ensure that his children would have their day in court. "Your Grace, Mr. Pemberton said formally, addressing Thomas with the respect due to his rightful title, "we have come to witness your uncle's confession and to ensure that justice is served according to law. The evidence you have provided, combined with testimony from surviving servants and the documents preserved by your father's loyal staff, will be sufficient to see Charles Blackthorne face the full penalty for his crimes." The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Charles's own confession, combined with the overwhelming evidence of his guilt, left no room for doubt or legal maneuvering. Within hours, he was taken away in chains to await trial before the Queen's bench, where his noble birth would provide no protection against the charges of murder and usurpation that would surely see him hanged. As the officials departed and silence settled over Ravenshollow House once more, I found myself alone with Thomas, Eleanor, and the ghost of the man I had come to love with all my heart. The magnitude of what we had accomplished was almost too great to comprehend. Yet beneath the triumph lay the bittersweet knowledge that our time together was drawing to a close. Thomas and Eleanor were now the Duke and Lady Blackthorne, rightful heirs to vast estates and enormous wealth, while I remained what I had always been, a seamstress of humble origins who had played her part in their restoration. The social gulf between us had become an unbridgeable chasm, though I knew they would always love me as the mother who had raised them with devotion and care. "Father," Eleanor said softly, turning to address Adrian's shimmering form, "what happens now? Your justice has been served, your children are safe and restored to their rightful position. Can you find peace at last?" Adrian's expression was serene, yet tinged with profound sadness, as he contemplated the question that had no easy answer. "My beloved daughter," he replied, his voice gentle with paternal love, I have remained in this world far longer than the natural order intended, sustained only by love and the need to see justice done. Now that my children are safe and my brother's crimes exposed, I feel the pull of whatever realm awaits beyond this earthly existence. But there remained one final matter to be resolved, one question that had burned in my heart throughout our supernatural courtship, yet had never been spoken aloud. As Thomas and Eleanor moved away to examine some family portraits, granting us a moment of privacy, I found the courage to voice the words that might determine my future happiness. "Adrian," I whispered, stepping closer to his ghostly form, "these weeks of knowing you have awakened feelings in my heart that I never thought to experience. I love you with a depth that transcends any earthly consideration. Yet you belong to a realm I cannot enter while life remains in my body. What future can there be for love such as ours?" His storm-gray eyes blazed with emotion so intense that I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Dearest Margaret," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "you have been the salvation of my children and the unexpected joy of my supernatural existence. I have loved you from the moment I first watched you tend their childhood hurts with such tender care, and that love has only deepened with each passing year of observation and protection." He paused, his form wavering as he struggled with the boundaries that separated our worlds. But then his expression grew determined, and I felt a change in the very air around us, a shift in the supernatural forces that governed his presence. "Love finds a way," he said, echoing words he had spoken before. Yet now they carried new meaning and possibility. "I cannot remain in this ghostly state forever, yet neither can I bear the thought of leaving you alone after all we have shared. There is another choice, a path that few spirits ever discover, but which becomes possible when love is pure and strong enough." As he spoke, his ghostly form began to change, becoming more solid and substantial with each passing moment. The ethereal quality that had marked his supernatural presence was fading, replaced by something that seemed increasingly, impossibly, alive. I watched in wonder and growing hope as color returned to his aristocratic features and warmth began to emanate from his approaching figure. "The love you have shown my children, the courage you have displayed in protecting them, the purity of heart that drew me to you across the boundaries of death, all of these have created a miracle that transcends the natural order," Adrian explained, his voice now carrying the full warmth and resonance of mortal speech. "The spirits of my ancestors have granted me a gift beyond price, the chance to return to life in the arms of the woman who saved my children and captured my heart." When he reached out to touch my face, his fingers possessed genuine warmth and substance, and I felt tears of joy stream down my cheeks as I realized that the impossible had become reality. Adrian Blackthorne, 7th Duke of Ravenshollow, had returned from death itself for love of a seamstress who had proven herself worthy of any man's devotion. "Marry me, Margaret," he said, his voice tender with love and hope. "Be my Duchess, the mother to my children that you have always been in truth, and let us create a family that bridges the gap between aristocratic duty and genuine affection. You have proven yourself noble in every way that matters, and I would be honored to call you my wife." Through my tears of joy, I could see Thomas and Eleanor watching us with expressions of wonder and delight. They had gained not only their father and their rightful heritage, but the prospect of our unconventional family becoming permanent and complete. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever adjustments would be required as they claimed their positions in aristocratic society, we would face them together as we had faced everything else. "Yes," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion as I gazed into the storm-gray eyes that had haunted my dreams and captured my heart. "Yes, my darling Adrian, I will marry you and stand beside you as we guide our children into their bright future. Love has indeed found a way to triumph over every obstacle, even death itself. Our kiss was everything I had dreamed it might be during those long nights of supernatural courtship, warm and passionate and filled with the promise of years to come. Around us, Ravenshollow House seemed to sigh with satisfaction, as though the ancient walls themselves approved of the love match that would restore happiness to chambers that had known too much sorrow. The spring of 1888 saw the most remarkable wedding London society had witnessed in decades, as the miraculously returned Duke of Ravenshollow married his beloved seamstress in a ceremony that celebrated both their triumph over evil and the power of love to transcend any earthly barrier. Thomas and Eleanor stood as our witnesses, radiant with happiness, as they watched their parents exchange vows that made official what had long been true in their hearts. Charles Blackthorne met his end at Tyburn, his crimes finally receiving their just punishment before the eyes of all London. His death closed the final chapter on the evil that had shadowed our family for 21 years, allowing us to begin our new life together with no fear of further persecution or danger. The years that followed brought joys beyond measure as we learned to blend love with duty, combining the genuine affection that bound our household with the requirements of our exalted social position. Thomas proved himself a worthy heir to the ducal legacy, while Eleanor became one of the most celebrated young ladies in London society. Both married for love in their turn, creating families that carried forward the values of compassion and integrity we had instilled in them. As for Adrian and myself, we discovered that a love strong enough to conquer death could certainly overcome any lesser obstacle that life might present. He proved to be everything I had dreamed a husband could be, passionate yet tender, noble yet humble, a man who never forgot that his greatest treasure was not his title or wealth, but the family that love had created and preserved. Sometimes, on quiet evenings as we sat together in the library where he had once died and been reborn, I marveled at the impossible journey that had brought us to such happiness. A seamstress and a ghost, united by love for two foundling children who proved to be heirs to a dukedom, had overcome murder and usurpation and supernatural barriers to create a family that would have seemed impossible in any world but this one. Love had indeed found a way, as Adrian had always promised it would. In the end, perhaps that was the only miracle we truly needed to believe in, the only force powerful enough to transform a humble seamstress into a duchess and bring the dead back to life for the sake of those they cherished beyond all earthly consideration. Our story became legend in the years that followed, whispered in drawing rooms and servant halls alike as proof that true love could triumph over any adversity. And if sometimes visitors to Ravenshollow House reported seeing ghostly figures walking hand in hand through the gardens in the twilight hours, well, perhaps some loves are indeed strong enough to echo through eternity, continuing their devotion long after mortal life has ended and the boundaries between worlds have once again been crossed for the sake of love that knows no earthly limitation.